You are listening to MCC Votes and Seats, the podcast series of the Center for Political Science of Mathias Corvinus Collegium. We provide election insights with experts and politicians. This time, we dive into the analysis of the recent presidential election and referendum in Moldova that were held on the same day, on the 20th of October 2024. We will discuss the campaign and its results, as well as the social, cultural, geographic, and demographic background of these happenings. We have the privilege to have Mr. Nicolae Panfil as our guest expert today, who serves as a director of the Monitoring Democratic Processes program at Promo-LEX, a non-governmental association that supports the development of democracy and the protection of human rights in the Republic of Moldova, including the Transnistrian region. Nicolae, we are thrilled to have you with us. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much for your invitation. This is very important to us. As we could observe in these elections, indeed, we had also a lot of attention of the international community of what was going on here in Moldova. So I'm very pleased to speak for your audience as well.
Thank you very much. And my name is Balinta Thoth from the MCC Center for Political Science, and I will be your host today. Off we go. Incumbent President Maia Sandu won the first and second rounds, so she was re-elected for a second and final term as the president of the Republic of Moldova. Her main competitor was former Prosecutor General Alexandru Stoianoglu. International media has portrayed the election as a choice between the pro-EU and the pro-Russia forces in Moldova. Nicolae, would you kindly elaborate a bit on the candidates of the presidential election? What were their main messages?
This campaign was different compared to other campaigns here in Moldova. Presidential campaigns, this was actually the fifth. It happened to be organized together with the referendum, as you already mentioned. The context was very much influenced by this referendum. We have to remind that there were attempts to register candidates, or some political actors attempted to get registered but were refused by the Central Electoral Commission for allegations of misconduct with their finances. And specifically, we will remember here that before the elections, so-called political bloc Victory, formed by a fugitive oligarch in Russian Federation, Mr. Shor, this political bloc comprising 4 political parties in Moldova was formed, and they have attempted to get registered in the campaign, but they were not accepted. It was actually for the first time in the history of Moldova that we saw an entity, a political entity that was not registered with the Central Electoral Commission, but in fact, they managed to campaign freely throughout the country, meaning that they campaigned illegally. This was a game changer because the efforts that this political organization, and many call it also a criminal organization, was quite impressive, quite large, for 2 reasons. One is for the presidential elections. Obviously, they didn't campaign with a candidate for the presidential election because they were not registered, but they were producing or spreading a lot of messages against the incumbent president, against Maia Sandu. And second, or foremost, the first actually message that they were attempting to promote was the message against the referendum. So they were promoting the option no at referendum, even though, again, they were not officially registered to campaign. Mr. Shor and his political bloc and affiliated parties, he was campaigning using illegal money of the Russian Federation, and according to Moldovan legislation, use of money from abroad for campaigning is illegal. Second, speaking about the candidates, we had for the first time again in these elections such a large number of independent candidates, which is quite unusual in the elections in Moldova, because in the parliamentary elections, for instance, we have quite high thresholds, and in the presidential elections, you have to really have a huge political capital to really get a chance to get in, at least in the second round. So there was a lot of discussion in the public space, discussions about the fact whether these candidates were truly independent candidates, whether those who were rejected by the CEC were really supposed to be independent candidates. For instance, in fact, we had some cases of people who attempted to get registered as independents, while, for instance, 2 days ago, they were members of one of the political parties who was part of this political bloc offshore. These elections, we had quite a lot of pressure on the institutions, on the Central Election Commission, on the legislation, which was tested in many aspects on how it will be implemented, how it will function. Because, for instance, this issue with the independent candidates, you may think that this is a quite simple question, but in fact, it raised a lot of discussions. How do we really assess who is an independent candidate? We have a specific legislation here. We have candidates can run on the name of the political parties, on the name of electoral blocks, and as independent figures. This was a playground for testing also the legislation. As I mentioned, we had these elections in parallel conducted with a referendum. And for the referendum, if I'm not wrong, there were 15 participants registered, 13 with the option yes and 2 with the option no. On top of these 2 with the option no, there was actually also Shor with his affiliated bloc, who was actually campaigning throughout the country without registration, but also with the option no. In 2023, the Constitutional Court of Moldova declared unconstitutional the Shor party. So Mr. Shor used to have another party before, and his party was declared unconstitutional for many instances of infringement of the legislation, specifically with regard to campaign financing and political financing here in Moldova. His party was the subject of many sanctions since 2015 until 2021. In every elections, they got sanctions or candidates were expelled from the race for many instances of misconduct. Based on this, the party was declared unconstitutional, but this didn't stop them, and they have formed this political bloc in the context of this presidential elections and the referendum. On the other side, there was 12 political parties and an electoral bloc who were registered to campaign for the referendum. But in fact, since the campaigning was going all together with the presidential elections, we observed that most of the activities were conducted as mixed activities. Like Maia Sandu was campaigning for herself, for the party Action and Solidarity, which she formed many years ago. And they were also conducting in parallel the campaign for the referendum. Most of the political parties in Moldova declared themselves pro-European. And then the question is why we had only 13 actors who has registered for the campaigning for the option yes at the referendum. And also the question was why so little campaigning was done by some political actors who declare themselves and who act as pro-European parties also, but were less involved in campaigning and less spent money for campaigning at referendum. And here we should come to the background of this referendum and the context of these elections in general, because it's an interesting matter. At the end of the year 2023, Maia Sandu, the president of Moldova, she announced this initiative of holding a referendum for European integration. And soon after this, the parliament changed also the legislation to accommodate this idea with the legislation, meaning that it became possible, according to the legislation, to the modified legislation, to hold a referendum together with another scrutiny, because the legislation previously was forbidding this kind of mixed organization of scrutinies. After this, there has started discussions in the society and consultations with political parties, but also with civil society about the referendum, about the opportunity of the referendum, and so on. And many were saying at that moment that Maia Sandu announced this initiative in order to actually support her presidential campaign, to have a separate or additional argument in the campaigning. This was the line of argumentation, like, look, if you would be really genuinely interested to hold a referendum and to have broader support for this idea and so on, you would have to do these consultations before the announcement actually of the referendum itself, and not like to capitalize only for your own benefit this topic. we can observe based on the findings from the campaigning party, and she personally, they were campaigning largely for the referendum and for elections, while other political parties, pro-European parties, less campaigned for the referendum. And some of them even declared that they got registered as participants at referendum with the option yes, just for ticking the box that, look, we have participated, we are supporters of the referendum, but in order not to be further blamed by the society as pro-European parties, but actually didn't really put much of effort into this idea. And of course, also the opposition used that idea that the referendum was called for supporting Maia Sandu's campaign, and they were using this in the presidential campaign to argue that, look, this referendum is irrelevant, this is not opportune at the moment, this is only for her own political benefit. This is the way the campaigning was conducted. This referendum gave an unexpected, probably, topic for the Russian and pro-Russian propaganda, the hybrid war that Moldova is going through, because it was connected to the presidential elections. Presidential elections per se wouldn't be that interesting for the Russians, for instance, if there wouldn't be this referendum. Here in Moldova, even though we are at the border with Ukraine, and from time to time also drones or rockets, parts of rockets land on our territory, since the war is going already in the third, or is almost to complete the third year, some of the parts of this society feel like, the war is somewhere far. Like Ukrainians are fighting, the war is far, and this is not going to affect us any soon. People started to get used to this idea. Moldova is going, however, through a very difficult and complex moment in its history now. We do understand, especially after the war started, and I think that Moldovan society started to feel this, to understand this better and better, that we do not really have like a dual choice as it was presented until recently, or some attempts to present even now, this choice, like we are divided society between the pro-European and pro-Russian society. I don't know who really in this society, in the Moldovan society, would really, looking at the Ukrainian experience, would really honestly say that they are with Russians, or they want the Russian world or the Russian mir to come in Moldova. This is not a real choice now. Even we have political parties now that present themselves as more in favor of relationship with the Russians and preserving those ties. This is coming as a sort of effect from the past. I don't see how we can build future with the Russians. I don't see how we can look into that direction. And the only choice that we really have is, since we are a small country, is to look what are the other options that we have. And the other option is European integration, obviously. But given the social context, the political context that we have, the economical also, at least partially a smaller part now of our economy, but still some argue that we are still tied to Russian economy in some aspects, we feel like we have a choice. In fact, there is no much choice here, but it is presented like we would have a choice. We have this political bloc created in the Russian Federation with Shor, who is advocating for the Russian interests here in Moldova, and they were the instruments of the Russian propaganda used here in Moldova, used for disinformation, used for vote buying. Given this context, I can understand that probably the intent of the president was to remind to the Moldovan society, I mean, we are not safe already. The fact that we have launched the discussions with the with the European Union, we got this status of a candidate country and so on, it is not yet guaranteed that we will get there if we do not make clear steps to advance into that direction. From the institutional point of view, yes, there is this also argument that, look, we have already signed these agreements with the European Union. Why would we need then the referendum? That referendum is done usually in the end of the process and all of these discussions. And yes, I mean, they are valid questions, they are valid points. But I personally explained for myself this idea of holding this referendum now, beyond these political probably arguments that were mentioned earlier, that we also as a society need someone, to shake us a bit, to make the society think about it, to make us understand that, look, we really have to make a choice, and a civilizational choice, if I can say, not only adopted by the institutions, but also by the society towards what direction we want to move.
Talking about the campaign behind this referendum, the political actors that were opposing the constitutional change, they claim that this modification of the constitution with a view to EU accession of the country would give a blank check, so to say, for the legislation. Do you agree with this?
So originally it started from the idea that we need to put in the constitution this geopolitical vector of development of the country. Even at that moment when the president announced this initiative, it wasn't clear. I mean, she didn't announce it as a constitutional referendum. It was announced just we need to put it in the constitution, but in what format, how to put this, where to put these proposals, it wasn't clear. We went public, and many other organizations went public with different initiatives and observations regarding this initiative. We, for instance, also criticized the fact of organizing elections together with the referendum on the same day. We had some bad practice in the past. Based on this, we argued that it wouldn't be okay to do this now. But on the other side, it is also a practice in other European countries, which is not forbidden. Also, the constitution of Moldova doesn't forbid that. Then we said, okay, we understand that this is a political issue, that the politicians want to do this. If this is to be done, then we see it opportune only if it is to be done as a constitutional referendum. If you do this as a consultative referendum, you can achieve better results with less effort. For instance, doing a poll. We have many polls done in Moldova. We already know that Moldovans were supporting European integration, so we didn't see a point. And then this idea came into the politicians' minds, and yes, they supported this and said that, yes, this is going to be a constitutional referendum. When it came to the discussion, what exactly to put in the constitution, of course, the main idea, and it is until now, after this validation of the results of the referendum, that the preamble or introduction to the constitution was modified to specify the aspirations of Moldovan people towards European integration and so on. However, indeed, there is this aspect also introduced in a separate chapter regarding some procedural things that were considered opportune by the politicians, and specifically giving the parliament a mandate to adopt some laws that would facilitate the European integration. Look, next year, actually in 2025, we will have parliamentary elections. And I do not think that politicians now in 2024 were putting this into the constitution with the aim or with the idea that they will also be the ones who will benefit from this in the future. The ruling party now will not probably have a majority in the next parliament. So it is very difficult who will actually benefit and how these provisions will be further used by the politicians. It is also not excluded that we will have maybe another referendum before actually signing the treaty, as it is done usually in the context of other countries that got to integrate with the European Union. So it will be up to the next parliament to see how it will use these tools that were provided now by the legislation.
Going back to the presidential ballot, President Maia Sandu defeated Alexander Stoyanoglu with about 55% of the votes compared to 45%. As for the voting procedure, more than 100 fraudulent or fraud-like activities were reported by your association, Promo-LEX. Nicolae, what is your opinion about the allegations of electoral fraud I just mentioned?
As an electoral observer with experience, I know that it wouldn't be correct to reflect on this based only on the findings from the election day. There is an entire electoral cycle that needs to be taken into consideration. In Moldova, at least, what is positive, what is good about our electoral system, about Moldovan democracy, that we are so-called electoral democracy. We may have some issues with the human rights, with the justice sector, with other aspects of the democracy. But when it comes to elections, we are a functional electoral democracy, meaning that it is quite difficult, actually impossible, to predict the results of elections, as in other countries is usually or may happen. Like, for instance, in authoritarian countries like Belarus or Russian Federation, this 54, 55% that Maia Sandu got, it is quite a discussion here in Moldova that she actually won the elections with the support of diaspora, and that she actually lost the elections in the country, meaning that people who live in the country voted for the other candidate, the majority of the people, and then the diaspora with 327,000 votes changed basically the outcome, the results of these elections. There is many unknown things how they will play on the election day, But speaking from the perspective of the electoral cycle, I mentioned earlier that, for instance, we were against this idea of holding elections together with the referendum in the same day. Okay, in the end, they have decided to do this. We have the legislation accommodated for that, and we started to observe the electoral process, how it was organized. And of course, we saw during the pre-election period and during the campaign period a lot of problems that, in my opinion, and in the opinion of our election observation mission, were more dangerous for the democracy and for elections than the simple technical organization of elections or some misconduct during the election day itself. And specifically, we have observed a lot of interference from abroad, as I already mentioned, from the Russian Federation through the political bloc of Ilan Shor, who were attempting to disturb the electoral process, informational warfare, for disinformation, for spreading a lot of misinformation about the referendum or negative information about the candidates and so on. We didn't observe until now so large, so broad, and so bluntly conducted vote buying in Moldova. Allegations of hundreds of thousands of people whose votes were bought by Shor and his network, and this is true. I mean, I cannot guarantee you the exact numbers to how many people they have reached and how many people voted actually as a result of this operation. But we had basically every day, almost every day, information from the police, from the National Anti-Corruption Body, from the prosecutors of searches, of arrests, of detention, of money that were seized, hundreds of thousands of euro and US dollars seized by the law enforcement, money that were illegally brought in Moldova for these operations, including for vote buying. Basically, this so-called network offshore, it operated like a pyramid with a lot of people at the bases and less people who were coordinating large masses of people as you go down. It was very efficient in this regard. People were recruited with the promises to get money for doing different things. Like, for instance, you would spread some leaflets or post some posters on the walls or in the streets and so on, and you will get some money. Or you will participate at some rallies and you will get some money. Or you will recruit more people in the network and you will get again some money. And people were registered through Telegram bots in this network, and people were submitting their IDs or passport data for getting bank accounts in the Russian Federation bank called Promo-LEX. It was absolutely unprecedented again, because we had a lot of people who were submitting their personal data abroad to someone who was acting illegally. People couldn't know what their data will be used for and so on. But because they were addressing very often people with less financial and social opportunities, poor people with material needs, they were quite successful. People were paid through, believe it or not, through these applications. Sometimes old ladies who didn't know how to use an iPhone or an Android phone were trained how to use this to install a bank application from the Russian bank, get this money on their bank application, and then using the Transnistrian region that we have, where these banks still operates, or they have possibility to operate through the Transnistrian banks, they were able to get this money, physical money, into their accounts. Estimations, police was announcing the beginning of October a number of around 130,000 people who had received money into their bank accounts from Promo-LEX bank installed on their phones, and later, closer to the election day, these numbers increased, and we had a lot of people also arrested or detained, or a lot of people got fines also for getting money for selling their votes. And the other phenomena that was also observed and involved is the classical use or abuse of administrative resources. Of course, this time, as we call this, the phenomena is usually associated with the ruling party, and it is clear that most of it was used or abused by the party in power, Action and Solidarity Party. And of course, beyond these two phenomena, we observed also again the use or the involvement of church in the campaigning. Church was involved in the collection of signatures in support of some candidates, but actually in the campaigning itself as well. And this is, again, prohibited by the legislation in Moldova. As with many other occasions, we have legislation, but it is not often enforced properly. It is for the first time in this election that we, for instance, saw that finally a priest got fined for campaigning or illegal campaigning in favor of one of the candidates. Moldovan church is divided here in Moldova. We have so-called Moldovan church affiliated to Russian Patriarchy, and we have Bessarabian Patriarchy affiliated to Romanian Church. So most of the instances of involvement of church were observed, of course, in the case of priests affiliated to Moldovan Church, affiliated to Russian Church.
I am amazed every time by the creativity of mankind when it comes to electoral fraud. You mentioned several times the ruling party of Action and Solidarity, which is a pro-EU, anti-corruption, center-right liberal formation, and the National Conservative Russophile Shore Party that was banned by the Constitutional Court last year. Besides them, which political parties and political organizations supported Sandu and which actors endorsed Stoianoglu?
Alexandru Stoianoglu, he was nominated as a candidate for the presidency from the Socialist Party. Socialist Party is also seen here in Moldova as a pro-Russian party. It was many years also in the past observed being supported by the Russia. But I think in the last years, Russian Federation also understood that they need to put, their eggs in different baskets, to act through many actors here. Mr. Stoianoglu was indeed a former prosecutor here in Moldova, so his affiliation with the Socialist Party was or is quite surprising in the sense that he tried also to present himself not as a politician. The party itself also tried to accommodate this idea that he would be the candidate of all, a common sense candidate for those who oppose Maia Sandu. However, they didn't manage to present him as such because there was a lot of disagreements also among these so-called pro-Russian parties here in Moldova. Of course, there was also other parties like party of the former Prime Minister Kiku, PDCM. There was also the former Bashkan of Gagauzia, which is an autonomous entity in Moldova, who participated as an independent candidate in the campaign for the presidency. But now she, after the elections, actually announced that she is forming a political party. On the side of Maia Sandu, actually it was her party, and the rest were like openly or less openly opposing her. The problem is here in that in Moldova, after the 2020 presidential elections and the 2021 parliamentary elections, the entire power went into the hands of this party of Maia Sandu, Action and Solidarity. In the parliament, they had around 63 mandates, and for the constitutional majority, they needed 67 mandates. So you can understand that they were quite close. In the presidency, there was Maia Sandu, and of course, they formed the government. So they were quite comfortable in this position. They got a lot of self-confidence also. As a result, they have kind of marginalized or other political forces, pro-European forces. The political process also in the parliament was also vitiated by the lack of consultations, lack of transparency. Because of this, they didn't build alliances around this pro-European party in power. And for instance, before the elections, but also during the election campaigns, all the polls were showing Maia Sandu and her party as number one in the polls, and then number 2, 3, and 4, and 5, up to 6 in the polls were coming either pro-Russian party or pro-centrist parties, and only 5th and 6th and so on were coming some pro-European parties with like 1 or 1.5% support in populations, expectations. This is a very dangerous movement because, as I told you already, we feel it like there will be very little possibility or probability that there will be a clear pro-European majority in the next parliament.
Let's address a bit the topic of electoral sociology and geography. Stoyanoglu led the counting within Moldova, particularly among rural areas and in the south of the country and Transnistria, winning 51%. He recorded back-to-back landslide results in the autonomous territorial unit of Gagauzia, where the Turkic Gagauz people live, and the Taraklia, the region primarily inhabited by the Bulgarian ethnic minority, winning more than 90% of the vote in each. However, Sandu led votes in Chisinau and the other cities among the youth and especially the Moldovan diaspora, where she won 83%. How the different layers of the society reacted to the election and the referendum.
When it comes to the presidential elections, for instance, Maia Sandu in 2020, she won actually in the country, but also the votes that she got in diaspora were like as a bonus, as an additional support that she got. However, now she is, for instance, contested by some political parties here in the country because of this argument that, look, you actually didn't win in the country. You just was winning abroad, and this result abroad is saving your mandate now. And these parties also are trying to put on the agenda this discussion again, whether the diaspora needs to vote, whether they have the same right as people in the country, and so on. And also there was a lot of expectations, that the referendum and the support for the referendum will also increase her chances. There were even voices that were saying that Maia Sandu can win from the first round because of this expectation that referendum will bring, results higher. And she is definitely associated with the pro-European champion, and clearly the votes would go to her because of this reason. This was a tough lesson for Moldovans and for political scientists here, for sociologists also, because it went quite the opposite, or almost the opposite. The referendum was passed with a bit more than 10,000 votes in favor of yes option, which was quite at the limit. One possible explanation for this result was this massive attempt or operation to corrupt people, because it was absolutely unclear. Look, how is this possible that in raions or in the regions, in the cities that were at the border with Romania, the border with the European Union, where there were a lot of European Union investments, people voted as they voted? This was unbelievable. I mean, no one was predicting this kind of results in these regions. This is something that I think we will have to further analyze to understand what actually happened there. And again, it can be partly explained probably through this operation of vote buying and disinformation hybrid war that was going on there, but it's probably not the only explanation we should search for. Another explanation that is being discussed here in Moldova is that fact that the ruling party and Maia Sandu personally, I mean, they were doing a lot, of course, to safeguard the country. When they took the mandate, soon after they took the mandate, the war started in Ukraine. They had to navigate through these difficult times of the crisis that emerged from the war, the energetic crisis, economic crisis, and so on. So there was a lot of challenges, and they has also championed with this European integration efforts, However, the people in the country felt that when it comes to the justice sector, for instance, and the reform that is going on, the expectations were much higher. Economical and social well-being of people was not ensured. The reforms were not done to bring this kind of results. With all these European integration efforts and openness that we got, with all these achievements in this direction, people felt that, look, what do we get from this? I still don't have anything to put on the table, like poor people. And these poor people were the target again offshore and all this Russian propaganda. And this was very much efficiently exploited by these foreign agents, political parties acting in the interest of Russian Federation. It was also this attitude, as I said, of the ruling party governing by themselves, do not really taking care of proper consultation, dialogue in the society, even with the opposition in the parliament, but also with the extra parliamentarian opposition. There was no cultivated dialogue. There was no cultivated common sense in the society with regard to the, what are the goals that we are following. This referendum was called in a moment when politicians were thinking like, oh, the polls are showing that we are 60% or 60% supporting European integration. It will be piece of cake, to pass it. And it turned not to be. And this is the lesson, I would say, that other politicians probably in other countries also could learn from Moldovan experience, because we can't blame the people. You mentioned Gagauzia, for instance. It was not a surprise for Maia Sandu to have this very limited, very small result there in the region, because this is well known to be a pro-Russian region, but it was historically very much in favor of or supportive of Russian sentiments here in Moldova. For instance, I can bring you in comparison the situation with the Transnistrian region, where more people actually voted for Maia Sandu compared to Gagauzia. And one more time to stress that Transnistria region is a breakaway region, and people, in order to vote, have to travel on the other side of the river, on our side, to come to the specially designated polling stations to vote, actually. And more people voted without having access to real information about Moldovan politics, because the information space there in the Transnistrian region is closed. Politicians cannot go there to campaign freely, and so on. And despite of this, we had this better result in the Transnistria region compared to the Gagauzian region, which is again one important thing that we have to analyze and to understand when it comes to Moldovan politics, and politicians have a lot of work to do there in the region.
It was a very essential claim. You just said a few minutes earlier, nothing is to be taken for granted anymore when it comes to elections in Moldova or in Eastern Europe or in Europe as a whole. A perfect ending remark for our episode. Nicolae Panfil from the Promo-LEX Association, we are rather grateful for your most thought-provoking and informative insights into the contemporary Moldovan political landscape, with special regards to the geopolitical concerns and the hybrid warfare, as well as the involvement of foreign agents in the election. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for this invitation, and hope it will be also an interesting podcast for your audience.
We wish you and your team all good luck for your current and future endeavors. Dear listeners, you've been listening to the latest episode of Votes and Seats, the podcast series of Mathias Corvinus Collegium about European elections. Take care. Goodbye.